How We Won by Charlotte T. Zitlow, Chapter 12, Point of Personal Privilege Behind the Scenes. In every election campaign, supporters emerge whom a candidate might not have known before or only tangentially. They may or may not be total strangers. They may not have played an active part in the campaign, but for a variety of reasons have been drawn by the speeches, the platform, the personality, or the style of the candidate. Or they may have seen a way in which they personally can affect the turn of events. They may see advantages for their own future. They are surprises, and they are an unexpected pleasure. They also may turn out to be the defining difference in how and what we might accomplish. In the Democratic campaign for the 1971 city election, there was no shortage of these unexpected surprises. They made a huge difference in developing ideas and strategy, learning about the community and connecting with the candidates, with voters. For the most part, they stuck around after the election and were critical to the effective implementation of our programs and plans. Jamie Murphy's election as clerk of the courts and manager of elections themselves was of supreme importance. First of all, she herself was a terrific campaigner. Though relatively new to Monroe County, her husband Whit, retired military, was still active in Crane Naval Ordnance Facility in Greene County, and the Murphys learned to know many of the folks at Crane, not usually a source of Democratic votes. Jamie's larger-than-life personality made her irresistible to people throughout the county, and her open-door policy in the clerk's office made her a comfortable ally for the Republicans in county government. She was free in her advice for city campaigns, especially with respect to voter registration, creating a voter registration office, and appointing a bipartisan staff. Pat Haley, a prominent Republican, and Carol Barakis, an active Democrat, expanding the pool of voters was her goal, and welcoming the newly enfranchised 18-year-olds was her pleasure. After the election, Frank McCloskey chose Jamie to run the Monroe County Democratic Party, and Ed Tracy stepped down in deference to the slate's massive victory. There were a number of Monroe County natives who saw Frank McCloskey and the council candidates as real prospects for getting control of the city, and many of them put their money on the slate that was emerging. David Rogers, the state senator who was the scion of an old Monroe County family, was critical. Frank had been a clerk in his law firm, and David, together with Dick Wilder, had persuaded Frank to run for state representative in 1970. David was not only a savvy political mind, he was an influential leader in the larger community, and his imprimatur carried a lot of weight. Having been in the state senate for 16 years and minority leader for several, David had an exceptional insight into the practicality of ideas and ways in which they could be implemented. With a dapper and very articulate manner, David's participation was critical. He played the mentor role superbly. Richard Dick Wilder brought a different kind of savvy. He had published the Star Tribune for years, a weekly window into the intrigues of Monroe and surrounding counties, full of local and regional political insights and gossipy tidbits. Dick had a sense of humor and sardonic wit that was a foil for Frank's Irish whimsy and zest for life. Dick's wife, Claire, was a remarkable woman in her own right. Together with their children, particularly Vivian and George, the family became strong personal, political, and financial supporters. The Wilders were well established and connected to a different social circle from David's. The Wilders were Bloomingtonians, too. Claire's father was a prominent ophthalmologist, and her mother was also a physician. Dick had his own law practice and was highly regarded. He was a major advisor to Frank, a drinking buddy, and his insights into the community enriched and enlivened the campaign. James Jim Register was the third of the most trusted advisors and lawyers who had chosen to support the young law student and the council candidates. Jim had been around for years, and the Registers were a large family deeply rooted in Monroe County. Jim had gone to Indiana University Law School with Hoagie Carmichael. He was a devoted jazz fan, traveling all over the country with Richard Dick Schmaltz to hear jazz greats of the mid-century. And they were frequent visitors to Indiana Avenue jazz scene in Indianapolis. His huge jazz record collection was a treasure. Jim was a shrewd country lawyer and he had a great deal of experience in municipal law under Tom Lemon. He was a goldmine of information about the ins and outs of annexation. He had good connections with Bob McCord of the powerhouse Indianapolis firm Ice Miller, Donadio, and Ryan, and we all beat a path to his door to understand local government better. Frank appointed him corporation counsel for Bloomington, and he was chiefly responsible for the lengthy and totally successful annexation of the following years. Bloomington Title Company was one of the few local businesses in 1971 that was run by a woman, Martha Ellen Sims, Martha, whose expertise in the title business was unexcelled in the county, and who took over the business alone when her husband Earl died, was extremely successful. The entire real estate community depended on her, and she was held in high respect. The fact that she decided to support Frank and the council slate was a real victory for the campaign. Martha became a major advisor on budgetary and municipal financial affairs, critical in steering us through complex money issues and helping us avoid uninformed fiscal mistakes in the campaign and for years thereafter. She became the Bloomington City Controller after the election and a cornerstone of the administration for years to come. Even before Frank indicated his interest in running for office, while he was still living in Indianapolis, his wife Roberta was cultivating likely supporters for whatever campaign he eventually would decide to run. In a German class at IUPUI, she met a young student, the president of the IUPUI student body, John Irvine. John was a moderate Republican, a thoughtful and meticulous fellow. He went on to law school in Indianapolis, while the McCloskeys moved to Bloomington, where Frank had taken a job with the Daily Herald Telephone. After 3 years of intense and successful practice with the Indiana Civil Rights Commission, John, a native of Bedford, moved to Bloomington, where he and the McCloskeys reconnected. John found himself helping in Lawrence County in Frank's run for state representative. Frank lost against C. Ferguson, but did unexpectedly well and developed a taste for personal politics. When in 1971 he was tapped to consider the run for mayor by David Rogers and his allies, John Irvine was recruited to help Roberta run the campaign. When Frank won the mayoral election, he named John his chief assistant. Of all the volunteers Frank attracted to this campaign, there is no doubt that Jim Ray was his closest and most influential friend. Martha Ellen Sims had known his father, James Ray Sr., a Bloomington police officer, and she introduced Jim Jr. to Frank. The two became very close very quickly. Jim was an ambitious, young real estate developer who had studied business at IU and had a promising and lucrative career ahead of him. He had developed many useful connections throughout the business community, and it was extraordinarily canny about the local economy. Together with Dr. Frank Rismolos, Jim and the future mayor spent a great deal of time over beers discussing the community, the business, social, and personal aspects of this small university manufacturing town. Jim, with the help of Dr. Frank, connected the candidate and consequently the rest of the slate with critical financial supporters. Jim Ray eventually spent years working in city government as Director of Public Works and Transportation, in redevelopment, and as a sort of special assistant to the mayor, making connections, clearing the way, coming up with proposals, and making sure projects, especially those involving infrastructure, were implemented properly. He was loyal and dependable, always keeping the best interest of Frank McCloskey foremost in his mind and actions. Dr. Rismolos was probably the most beloved physician in the area. He grew up on Kirkwood near Nick's English Hut, which his father Nick founded and owned. He was widely known as Dr. Frank, and it seemed to me that every other person in town was one of his patients. Dr. Frank and his wife Becky were the heart of the Greek community here, and that, too, extended his deep understanding of who was who, and what was what, and when to do whatever was necessary. He worked hard as long as he lived, and was one of those doctors who still made the rounds when he was in his 80s. He knew virtually everyone, and he liked this young Irishman. Despite his political affiliation as a Republican, he supported Frank throughout his years as mayor and later member of Congress. He loved to talk and was an invaluable mentor for his namesake. An almost mythical hostess, Nancy Solomon, presided over a sort of continuous salon on Brown Cliff Road, just north of the city limits. In her well-appointed and elegant home, there was always food, drink, and, most importantly, conviviality. Nancy was an issue-oriented woman who had been very active with the Eugene McCarthy 1968 local primary campaign and who emerged as a serious strategist from the ashes of that election. To assure that her next venture would be victorious, she became deeply involved in the reshaping of the Monroe County Democratic Party. As one of the early strong supporters of the local Planned Parenthood affiliate, Nancy was unflagging advocate for reproductive rights, for civil rights, and for social justice. Nancy was a delegate in 1972 to the Democratic National Convention and worked ceaselessly to achieve an acceptable gender balance of the Indiana delegation. Would-be candidates with a liberal bent flocked to her home for discussion, approbation, advice, and support. Nancy offered a haven for left-wing advocates, but she also dealt out very practical organizational and campaign advice. She was intent on winning, and she was intent on promoting issues. One could always engage in a serious and robust discussion on Vietnam, the Great Society, civil rights and civil disobedience, gay rights, or abortion, and had to expect to defend whatever view one had with facts, logic, and energy. Nancy was prepared. She was also enormously kind. Nancy Solomon provided a forum and an incubator for social justice issues, and many ideas generated under her purview found their way into the fabric of Bloomington's life through policies and programs. For years, Nancy maintained her open-door policy, and her influence on the city Democratic administration was immeasurable. In her 2005 obituary in the Herald Telephone, then-Mayor Mark Cruzan described her as an institution whose blessing was a treasured endorsement. One of Nancy Solomon's closest protégés, who went on to a stellar political and public service career, was Jeff Richardson. For Jeff, Nancy was a mentor, a caretaker, and a sterling example of a no-nonsense, well-informed political activism coupled with gracious hospitality and care for her many students of realpolitik. Jeff first met her at an anti-war demonstration in his first year as an out-of-state freshman at IU, and with her tutelage and that of others to whom she directed him, he went on to become student body vice president of the 1971-72 academic year during our campaign and president in 1972-73. Thus, Jeff was president of the student body during our first year in office and joined the power of his office to create Bloomington, the city of peace. During a critical moment of the Vietnam War, when other campus towns were experiencing looting, violence, and general mayhem, the city and the students gathered signatures for peace throughout the community and held forums to give everyone a chance to speak. Jeff and the city learned their Solomon lessons well. In 1970, Reverend Ernest B. Butler, known as Rev, stunned the community and the region by being elected Bloomington Township trustee. He was the first black office holder in memory, a Democrat, a militant civil rights activist, and the preacher of the largest black congregation in Bloomington, Second Baptist Church. Bloomington had a substantial black community, well established and reaching back to before the Civil War. At one time, in the not-too-distant past, it had been primarily Republican, with its roots in the party of Lincoln, but the politics of the civil rights movement rallied its supporters to the Democratic Party. John F. Kennedy was beloved, and Lyndon B. Johnson had strong-armed even the Southern Democrats into allowing the civil rights laws to come into being. Rev had been in Selma and had marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and was an advocate not only for the black community but for the poor, the undeserved, and the proponents of social justice. Many of us city candidates had worked for his victory as a trustee in 1970, and through him had learned to know many active supporters. The 1971 campaign felt like a natural continuation of the 1970 victory, so we campaigned hard on the west side. Rev's major bailiwick, however, the Second Baptist Church, drew its members from all of Bloomington and many of the gradually increasing number of black faculty and students from IU. The increasingly integrated staff at IU and slowly growing black professional community that was brought in with Otis and GE also were active in the congregation. It was a welcoming center of integration where white people were also embraced and added a dimension to the campaign that was unprecedented. The Black Elks Club on West 7th Street, aka The Hole, was a social center in the community and also became a venue several city candidates visited frequently. Rev was a powerful preacher and an effective trustee. In Indiana, the system of township trustees is viewed by many as an anachronism, an elected position that has the charge of providing fire protection and schools where they do not exist, and poor relief, the last resort for those who are in desperate need of medical care, utility deposits, rent, and school books. Indiana is a state that has traditionally avoided social welfare programs as much as possible, and the trustee really plays a critical role in the survival of people in real need. Rev had defeated a particularly parsimonious Republican in 1970 and had more clients than he could accommodate in his budget, but his response was to push to increase the budget rather than cut services. As a trustee in Monroe County, he was a maverick and a big hero to many of us, including Frank McCloskey. His blessing was valuable and was intentional. We had to earn it. Rev's 1970 campaign was run with energy and strategic brilliance by an unexpected supporter, Gloria Enguandanos, the wife of faculty member. Gloria was born in Spain and brought vibrant energy and commitment to Reverend Butler's campaign. She never stopped, bridging the gap between the black community and the university-affiliated voters who had little understanding of the trustee position. Gloria forged alliances that turned out to be invaluable in the 1971 city campaign. Gloria was dependable, indefatigable, and demanding. She added immeasurably to our success. For years, Shirley and Terry Connors had played roles in the emerging Democratic Party in Monroe County that was unique. Terry was a professor in the Labor Studies Department, a hotbed of liberal activists and a suspect program for many of the more conservative members of the faculty. Indiana was, at one time, one of the states with a very high percentage of labor union members. With manufacturing as the bedrock of the Hoosier economy, the workers of the automobile and steel industries, as well as coal mining, were not only organized, their unions were strong and powerful in state politics. Terre Haute was home of Eugene Debs, whose name to this day is still hallowed there, and the railroad workers' unions were very active in that city, which is still crossed with railroad lines that serve the coal fields. John L. Lewis had started the United Mine Workers in the coal fields of western Indiana. Gary, East Chicago, and the rest of the Calmont region were the major centers of steel manufacturing. The automobile industry was so prevalent throughout the state that Indiana had, after Michigan, the second largest number of automobile-related and unionized workers in the country. Indiana was home to many trucking companies, and the Teamsters were a force. IU was an obvious home for labor studies, and Terry was a vigilant member of the faculty, together with Dale Brickner, Ron Weber, and Higdon Roberts. The Connors had a passel of 6 children and maintained an open house that provided an important opportunity for diverse communities to come together in a relaxed social setting. Shirley got involved early on in the Democratic Party. Small though it was at the time, she knocked on doors, did all the work anyone wanted, and took her job seriously. As an activist, Shirley joined forces with Tommy Allison to form the Citizens for Good Government to focus voters' attention on specific issues that were not necessarily partisan, but were, in their opinions, matters of good government. The focus on food stamps in the 1970 election as an alternative to commodities, i.e. the distribution of government surplus food, led to a turnover among the trustees and the members of the county council who had to support one or the other system of addressing hunger. This focus contributed to the election of Reverend Butler, too. When the city council election came to the forefront, the Citizens for Good Government went right to the work. Shirley was particularly trenchant as a supporter of the city campaign, demanding exact positions, no muddying, and instructing us candidates so that we not underestimate the importance of whatever the issue. When I was considering running for council, I called Shirley, who told me I must run, and when I demurred, she pointed out that I certainly knew more than the current members seemed to, and that I would ask questions. She went on to point out that state code gave city councils extensive power as the legislative branch, and that the council had never even begun to wield that power. It was, she said, high time that we had a proactive council that did not wait for the mayor to tell them what to do. That, of course, resonated with all of us. In her capacity as co-chair of the Citizens for Good Government, she tried to keep a neutral position, and in the interviews and the endorsing process, she maintained that position. However, when she was out on the hustings with us, there was no doubt whom she was supporting. I doubt that anyone was surprised. Citizens for Good Government was the brainchild of Shirley and Tomelia Allison, who brought two different styles to their important organization. Tommy was raised in California and came to Bloomington with her husband Jim, where he was hired by the psychology department. Tommy brought a determined air, a devotion to research, and a penchant for hard work to the organization, which would serve her very well when she joined the city council in 1979 and then was chosen mayor of Bloomington in 1983. She, like so many, played a role in the variety of community efforts for social justice and was an active member of the League of Women Voters and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Shirley and Terry Connors had frequent impromptu parties that pulled people together, labor studies, other faculty, people from town, and always a fair number of black faculty and townspeople. There was not much political debate, but there was dancing of all things. It all seemed at once strange and natural. There was no question but that we were all working for something more in Bloomington, and we all thought we knew what that was. However, these evenings did not include some of the women who would prove to be the longest-lasting, most dependable, and most demanding supporters from the West Side. Myrtle Jackson, the Queen of Jackson Street, had been deeply involved with the Christian Center, a locus of secular activity on the Hill. She helped organize the subsidized housing project built to replace older existing properties and kept tabs on it despite her failing health. She knew most of the permanent residents in her neighborhood, and she advised them all on whatever they needed advice for. A hardcore Democrat, she remembered the Great Depression, and she was committed to making the Great Society work. Her daughter, Mary Pryor, lived with her on Jackson Street, and Mary was the one who moved around the community, making sure everyone knew what Myrtle felt was important. The two of them really did know the community. They forged a strong alliance with Reverend Butler, and they brought the low-income white community to the polls and then into participating in city affairs after the election. The two of them became strong and clear advisors to Frank McCloskey and to members of the council. They had their fingers on the pulse of the West Side. Tobiatha Eagleson was the widow of a gentleman whose parents had run a boarding house on 8th Street for black students in the early years when they were finally admitted to IU. In 1971, it had been only recently that IU allowed black students to live in campus housing, so the Eagleson rooming house was famous. Among others, the NFL trailblazer George Taliaferro had lived in Eagleson House when he arrived to play for Indiana in 1945. Tabby now lived up the hill on 11th Street, a widow who kept track of the neighborhood and was yet another major contact for all of us to learn what was happening on the West Side. Tabby read prodigiously. She asked a lot of questions, constantly seeking specific information about a variety of issues from infrastructure to healthcare to planning and zoning. After the election, Frank named her to the Board of Public Works early in his regime, where she remained for years. The West Side was a wealth of effective, no-nonsense supporters who had been movers and shakers in their own community and churches and were recruited to work with the Community Action Program. They emerged to work with the New Democrats. Willie Ethel Streeter was one of the wise women in the Crestmont senior housing projects. Like Tabby Eagleson, she knew her way around, and her instincts were humane, tough, and the embodiment of the goals we had set for the campaign. She made sure we met the people who could be most helpful, and she introduced us to the whole family of Norrises, Catherine and her children, and those of her cousin Mary, the formidable late director of Head Start. Second Baptist Church was one of the centers of the West Side community, and these women and their families welcomed us to their world in a way that made us comfortable and introduced us to many of the West Side residents, as well as to many parishioners who lived throughout the city. In 1971, labor unions were still very much a part of the political fabric. The local AFL-CIO council included a number of Republicans, especially the trade unions, but they were very much a force and as union members committed to the concepts of collective bargaining and fair labor practices. Republicans and Democrats alike communicated, and we worked to earn their support. The industrial unions, the Industrial Union of Electrical Workers, IUE, International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, IBEW, Communication Workers of America, CWA, and the Plumbers and Steamfitters were more unequivocally Democrats, and we learned to know their leaders and members. Jane Baxter, business agent with the CWA, was the queen of the southwest side of Bloomington, and she was a bit leery about this new bunch of people she had never seen in action. However, when she saw how hard we worked and how much we appreciated her direction and suggestions, she began to come around. Without Jane, her daughter, and a coworker, Mary Ann Lambert, as well as her extensive South Side connections, we would have had a hard time making a good showing in Perry 5 and 6. Through the first years of our tenure, as we worked to assure that the firefighters and the police were organized, Jane Baxter was an extremely helpful advisor. Of course, the reorganized Democratic Party was full of committed activists who felt it was the time for change and who went all out to implement the plans of the campaign, canvassing their precincts, making sure literature got dropped at the appropriate times, helping to arrange coffees, cocktail hours, and other events. Without their work, we very well might not have won. But the hardcore of the campaign came to depend as well, and more unexpectedly, on these folks who were constantly advising, supporting, suggesting, warning, encouraging, and spreading the word that we all did offer a better way. Of all the groups converging in 1971 to determine a better way, the Voters Union may have been the most critical. It was their laser-like focus on key issues that defined the strategy and tactics. Al Toll was the most visible leader, but he was equally supported by others in the background at the Ruble Computing Center. Bruce Ashby, a brilliant writer who composed the informational flyers called Yellow Sheets, Ed Kubatis and Jim Doerr, computer programmers who analyzed the statistics and mapped out the campaign strategy, Marilyn Schultz and Jackie Prose, who brought fresh insights and grassroots experience, and many others. The VU brought focus and coherence that it allowed the motley crew to act as a team while continuing to maintain our individual stamp on the effort. One last acknowledgement. Among the precinct committee persons, Pat Gross ran one of the tightest ships in the community in the new subdivision of Sycamore Knolls and the surrounding southeast of Bloomington, but even more importantly, Pat and her husband Bob emerged as two of the most insightful political minds, strategizing, calculating, and figuring out what was the most effective way to carry the day and do and say the right thing. Bob was a professor in the English department, one of the two most politically active departments at Indiana University. The psychology department came as a close second. Bob had roots in a union family in New York City and brought a kind of street smarts enhanced with great intelligence and fervent commitment to liberal ideas to the table, demanding excellence and figuring out a way of achieving it. Pat was instrumental in changing the face of the party and was destined to become a part of the core group. She, with her husband Bob, was so influential to the basic strategizing that they need to be mentioned alongside with the others. Their contributions, too, were essential to the way things turned out. When I came to Bloomington from Ann Arbor in the summer of 1964, I had left behind a well-organized precinct that produced Democratic pluralities. It was the presidential election year with Lyndon B. Johnson running against Barry Goldwater and Vance Harkey, the liberal senator, running against Homer Capehart in Indiana. It seemed an urgent set of races, but I had trouble finding any kind of organization with whom to volunteer. I met a few people who were organizing isolated campaigns, but no real solid Democratic Party organization. So the emergence of all the totally unexpected people of like mind for me was a great revelation, relief, and source of inspiration. These and many more people not only provided support for the campaign, they provided the reason for campaigning altogether. It was for the community, however large that may have been, that we were working to create a better way, and the community, as it gradually took shape of many individuals who began to follow us, made it worthwhile and became the focus of the campaign more than ever.